Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 30. Thank you so much to everyone who has stuck with me for 30 episodes. I've been really enjoying sitting down every week and diving a bit deeper into these really complex topics. I love hearing your feedback on these episodes, and in this week's episode, I want to talk about oversharing. What is it? Why do we do it? And where does it come from? Why do we overshare? This is something that I've found to continue to be a challenge for me, even recently. More often than not, I find that my husband is the one reassuring me and reminding me that I don't always have to explain myself. But despite his reassurance, I still sometimes find myself feeling really uncomfortable when I don't explain myself, when I don't put too much information out there, because I always feel like I want to make sure all of my bases are covered. So let's get into it. Oversharing for me feels like over-explaining myself, where I'm using way too many words, I'm putting way too much information out there than what's actually necessary. I'm doing all of this because I want to feel comfortable myself. And so when I start to trace this back and I think about where this behavior comes from, the first thing that comes to mind is this idea and this fear of disconnection. When you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, I think it's relatively common for disagreement to lead to disconnection. And if it doesn't always, the possibility is always there. And this disagreement could be a result of you making a mistake, a very simple mistake, or maybe you not showing up for your responsibility, which might be something really convoluted, like offering reassurance to a parent during a really big, stressful family argument. Whatever it might be, if you don't meet or exceed your parents' expectations, that disagreement might lead to disconnection, whether that's stonewalling or the silent treatment. And in reflecting what that was like throughout childhood, it is so incredibly scary to be stonewalled by a parent, by your primary caretaker, someone who is providing you with the basic necessities of life because you made a mistake or because you didn't do something that made you really uncomfortable. And now you're doing everything and anything possible, going out of your way to try to repair that relationship, to try to reestablish some kind of connection, but you're met with nothing. You might be apologizing for something that in truth you shouldn't even have to apologize for. You might be going out of your way to try and do something that normally makes your parent really happy, but you're getting no reaction from them whatsoever. And that's such a scary feeling that experience can be really traumatizing. And I think on top of that, when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, I know I felt like two perspectives or two opinions about the same thing couldn't coexist in the same environment. It was stressful, there was tension, and I think in one way or another, emotionally immature parents try to force or coerce their children into becoming extensions of them, where they share in their opinions, they share in their thought process, and I think this comes from a fear of individuality. Emotionally immature parents and narcissistic parents alike, I think, thrive on control. They like to have power. And it's much harder to control someone who has a sense of who they are, who has their own opinions. They're embracing their individuality, and they understand that they are separate people from their parents. They have their own minds and agency to make their own decisions. And so I think it's really common for emotionally immature parents in one way or another, whether you're getting yelled at or punished when you express an opinion that's different from that of a parent. Whether there's this underlying tension anytime you have a conversation and you disagree about something in one way or another, I think you're conditioned to really share in as much as you possibly can with your emotionally immature parent, because that makes them comfortable. I think that reassures them that they'll be able to maintain some sense of power and control over you. And so this idea that multiple perspectives can be present about the same thing was foreign to me for a really long time. And I think that's why the concept of agreeing to disagree makes me so uncomfortable. And there are times when my husband and I disagree, normally, as you do. I think it's completely natural for there to be disagreements in relationships. I think it's healthy, even because you can't expect everyone to feel the same way about everything. And, this, just a bit of a tangent, this is a concept that's touched on in Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson. She talks about mentalization, which is this developmental milestone that children and young adults experience where they start to realize that everyone around them is experiencing life and perceives reality in a way that is unique to them. Their life experiences informs a lot of their decisions and their reactions and the way that they feel about the world. But this idea, I think, is really lost on emotionally immature parents. And I don't know if it's because they're scared of this idea. I don't know if they don't have the emotional capability to understand something like this. But for me, I always felt like everyone had to be on the same page about everything because that's what I was kind of taught to believe when I was growing up. And so now when my husband and I disagree, granted, there are times when we disagree because someone did something that was obviously wrong. They said something hurtful and we come together and sort of reach a common ground. But there are other times when, because of our own unique life experiences, we have a different opinion on something, where our ideas are fundamentally different. No one is more right or wrong than the other. They're just different. And so there are times when the best thing you can do in a conversation or a disagreement like that is agree to disagree. And despite my rational brain, I guess, speaking and saying that this is okay, I still think there's part of me that's really fearful that this disagreement is going to lead to disconnection. And so I still sometimes fight against that reason and try to over-explain myself. I think I continue to overshare to the point that I feel comfortable that I've put enough of my side of things out there that even if you don't agree with me, at least you understand where I'm coming from, because that's what I feel I need to do to feel safe. It's still something that I'm getting used to. When we can approach an issue, we can fundamentally just have different ideas about it, but our two perspectives can coexist with one another. And that's not going to take away from our connection. That's not going to lead to further disagreements down the road. It's just one of those things where we don't have to be on the same page, which can be really hard to grasp when throughout so much of your childhood, you were kind of forced to always be not only on the same page, but on the same exact line as your parent. And so taking this one step further and kind of applying it to other relationships in our lives, I think oversharing can also be broken down to this really fundamental want or need to be understood. And I think this can be heightened if you were raised by an emotionally immature parent and now maybe you're dealing with friends or a romantic partner. If you didn't experience that sense of being understood from your parents, where you found yourself questioning, do they even really know who I am? I think that feeling of wanting to be heard and seen by a partner or a friend can be that much more intense as you move into adulthood because you're craving that. It's like the more you don't have of something and the longer that feeling persists, it kind of builds up until it's just going to explode onto someone who is in the wrong place at the wrong time with you. And that can be a really hard thing to recognize, but I think it's important to remember that when you're dealing with emotionally immature parents, I don't think they have the emotional capability always to show up for their children in a way that they need. That's where this idea of emotional neglect comes into play because they're so self-focused and they're so preoccupied with what's going on in their own lives that they don't always have time or space to show up for someone else in a way that they need and deserve. And so there's this very sort of basic, almost primal desire to want to be understood by a friend or a partner. You want to feel like they know who you are, like they hear you and they see you. I think there's a lot of comfort in that we can really crave when we didn't experience that throughout our childhood. I think there's also this added layer of complexity. When you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, I think you come to the realization that they will intentionally misunderstand you when it's convenient for them. It can be hard enough to communicate with an emotionally immature parent as is. You can talk to them about a particular idea or topic. You can ask them the same question that you asked them a week ago. But now, depending on the day, the time of day, whatever's going on in their life right now, what conversation they had right before they spoke to you, that will have a massive impact on the reaction that you get from them, which can make navigating a relationship like this so incredibly unpredictable and at times even volatile, because maybe you asked your parent to go out and do something with a friend on a particular day. And when you first brought this up, it was fine. It was a decent conversation and they agreed. Now, a few days or a week later, that plan is no longer convenient for them because they changed their mind and they want to do something else, or they don't want you to go anymore because they're not feeling as great that day. And so you bring it back up to just remind them, hey, I'm going to do this tomorrow, remember? They might flip a switch and completely feel differently than they did when you initially brought it up. And so one day, you can have a decent conversation about something, and the next, that same topic might trigger a massive argument, just a huge blow up, which can be so confusing. It can make you scared to ask anything. And I think oversharing comes into play because we don't want to leave anything out there for interpretation. We don't want to leave any questions. And so I think more often than not, I think I developed this pattern. I'll say what I'm doing, where I'm going, what time, who I'm going with. I'll bring it up multiple different times just to make sure that it's known, that it's out there, because I don't want things to change all of a sudden. It's so exhausting, I think, and it all just comes from wanting to avoid conflict. It all comes from wanting to be understood by someone who's really important to you. And yet when you're dealing with people who at times are committed to misunderstanding you, you're fighting a losing battle. And it can be so easy, especially I think for narcissistic parents, to manipulate this kind of interaction. Where, again, let's say you asked a parent if you could go out and do something with a friend on a particular day. And that day comes and you're getting ready to go and your parent asks you, oh, where are you going? And you tell them, oh, remember a few days ago I asked you if I could do this and you said this, I'm going here with so-and-so. They can take your words and completely twist that experience. They can gaslight you into believing that, oh no, you never asked me. Well, you never said that you were going there. You said you were going here and I was okay with that, but I'm not okay with you going here. And now you're completely confused. You're doubting your own perception of reality, which is exactly what they want. And if they don't want you to go, they'll find whatever way they can to try to coerce you into not going, or to make you feel like a really bad person for actually following through with it. And I think this is where the idea of adult children who were raised by emotionally immature parents or narcissistic parents develop PTSD or CPTSD. And this is something that I learned about in the past few months. It's not something that I've known about for a long time. I typically associated that with people who were in the army, people who fought, who were in these really high stress, intense situations where they felt like their life was at risk. And it wasn't for a long time that I finally started to connect the dots. I remember almost feeling foolish, like I shouldn't ever make that connection between something like PTSD and my own experience, because I've heard and read about so many really intense stories that I couldn't possibly imagine that something that I experienced throughout childhood even held a candle to something that intense. It felt almost disrespectful in a way to apply that to my own life. But when you reflect on experiences like this, and again, we're talking about a child here, someone who is not entirely emotionally mature. We don't have the tools or the skills yet to navigate life and these more complex feelings. We're thrown into these environments where everything looks very similar. It all looks like the ground, but depending on where I step, there might be a huge explosion. That's exactly what it's like when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent, with an emotionally immature parent, because again, you can go to them with one thing on one day and then take that same thing to them even an hour later and get a completely different reaction. Where at one point it was okay, and now you're a bad person for ever wanting to do that. Now you never even said that. You never told me you were going to do that. And so navigating a relationship with an emotionally immature parent, I think in a lot of ways can be related to the feeling of navigating a minefield, where it all looks very similar, but we don't know what's going to happen until we actually start to take some steps. And so the more I started to look into oversharing, I came across fawning as a trauma response. And before I came across fawning, the only real trauma responses, or the ways that I understood that your body responded to conflict or controversy or a scary situation, was fight or flight. And now I know that there are 4. There's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And what was really interesting to me about fawning and that behavior and the connection between that and oversharing is that fawning is done to avoid controversy. You're going out of your way to try to appease the person that you're afraid is going to hurt you, in the hope that you can sort of outdo them with your kindness and with your attention. So they might not actually do the thing that you're fearful of them doing. And what I found to be really interesting in the research that I started to do about fawning is that it said fawning is a behavior and a response that someone develops when they've experienced fight or flight one too many times, when that reaction has been called upon one too many times. And it makes perfect sense for me, because when you're dealing with a parent-child relationship, especially under the age of 18, if you're dealing with a minor who is not yet able to be self-sufficient, you can't quite leave. It's either not an option or would be really difficult. You may not have anywhere to go. You might be too young to even think about leaving your house and running away and being able to survive. And so you can't really leave. So flight is kind of off the table. And then you've got fight, and you can't quite fight either. There's the obvious size difference. There's an inherent power dynamic that's involved. I remember feeling so intimidated by my parents' size and volume that I never once thought to fight back. Because even at such a young age, I think I understood, what am I going to do? I'm not going to fight and win here. And so you can almost feel trapped in that environment. I can't leave and I can't fight back. So you develop this fawning response, which is, I'm going to do everything in my power that I feel necessary to make this other person happy so that hopefully they don't do anything that's hurtful towards me. And I think oversharing plays into that in a lot of different ways, where we want to make sure that we're saying and doing everything. We're laying it all out there on the table so that there's no misunderstanding, so that everything is out there. Nothing is left for interpretation. There are no questions, because we just want to make sure that nothing bad happens. And over time, we start to develop this feeling like we will do anything and everything to make sure that this is the case. So when you fawn, you essentially merge yourself with the wants and needs and desires of another person in the hope that you can avoid conflict and controversy. But what you're doing in those instances, I've learned in the research that I've done and in reflecting on my own experience, is that you're actually opening yourself up for a bit more trauma. Because now it's like this behavior is allowed. And regardless of what happens, what is said or done to you, you're always just going to go out of your way to try to make this other person happy because you're fearful of what might happen when they're unhappy. And I think this experience is far too common when you're dealing with emotionally immature parents. And I think there's sort of a direct correlation between this fawning response and this oversharing pattern of behavior that so many of us develop. We don't want to get in trouble. We don't want to upset another person. And so we say everything that we feel like we possibly can say to be understood so that the other person understands where we're coming from. Yesterday, actually, my husband and I celebrated our 1-year wedding anniversary. And so we went out and we had a really wonderful day. And by the nighttime, we had worked up quite a bit of an appetite. And so we decided to go out to eat to celebrate. And we decided that we wanted to try a new place. And so we were both looking at the map, trying to find a new restaurant that we hadn't gone to before. And I found this one place that looked really great. It was a Mexican place, and I had just been craving quesadillas and burritos, and I was like, this is the place that I want to go, which can be a hard enough thing to do for people pleasers, for people who aren't used to directly communicating their own needs to a partner, to say, hey, I found this place and I want to go here. But on top of that, I show it to my husband, and as I'm suggesting this place to him, subconsciously, I'm already starting to process the possibility that when we go there, the food might not be good, the service might not be good, we might not like the actual environment, something might go wrong. We might not have as good a time as we would want to have when we go out to eat. I'm fully aware of that. And I think subconsciously that started to inform everything that came after the initial suggestion of, hey, look at this place that I found. I started saying, oh, well, it's in this location, so it's close to this place that we like, right? That's a pro. And look, the food looks really great. And I looked up the menu. There's a lot of stuff that we like. Oh, and also, the reviews are really good. And so I'm listing off all of these things. I'm over-explaining myself. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that because I don't want to feel entirely responsible for an experience, especially when someone else is involved, if it goes poorly. And I think the reason for that is because I'm fearful that if I put myself out there and I directly communicate an idea that I have, I am now responsible for this experience and how everyone else is going to experience this also. And if that's negative, then that's going to be a reflection on me, which I think is why so many of us hesitate to put ourselves out there and offer up a suggestion in the first place. That in and of itself can be a huge step to start to take. And so now I'm kind of trying to reassure my husband, but in truth myself, that I've done the research, I've looked into this place, I've kind of vetted it so that if things don't go to plan, if we don't have as great a time as hopefully we would want to, at least I did the work. I did the homework. I don't want you to think that I just made a quick decision and now that's why we're not having a great time because I didn't look too far into this. And I think it all comes from this fear of being punished or being yelled at or the incredible negativity that can come along with any kind of a negative experience when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent. Because it's not just, oh, well, the food wasn't that good. It's, I can't believe we picked this place. I didn't want to go here, but you wanted to go here, so here we are. And now we wasted this time and this money, and we're never going to get this experience back. There's so much weight that can be tied to every single experience and decision when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent that it can make you fearful to make decisions at all. Because there's nothing that feels as bad as that disapproval and that disappointment from someone that you care about, especially when it comes to something that you were suggesting as a positive, something that you thought would be a really great time. I think finding out that you're wrong can be hard enough, but when you've got someone sort of rubbing that in your face and making it that much worse, it can be traumatizing. I think it can really stick with you. And so I'm listing off all of these different things because, I want my husband to know that I've put some thought into this and that, if anything happens, well, I didn't know. I really thought it was going to be great. I was misled just like you. And, he stops me and he's like, you don't have to explain yourself. Let's go. Let's go. And that comfort and that confidence from another person in a decision that I pushed for is unmatched. And it's still something that I'm getting used to because even then, right, there's this little voice in the back of my head that's like, well, you're saying that now, but if we get there and it's not what you thought, then, you might switch things up and you might not be as happy or easygoing as you are right now. And in truth, I know that my husband's not going to yell at me. I'm not going to get punished when we get home because I suggested a restaurant that maybe wasn't all that. And yet that voice can still be there because you've experienced it for so long. You've endured that kind of behavior from someone who is really important to you throughout your life for such an extended period of time that it doesn't just go away overnight. But I can't stress enough how important it is to fight against those impulses when you're dealing with an emotionally mature partner or friend or sibling. Because the truth of the matter is, they're not going to hold a decision like that against you. If you show up to the restaurant and it's not everything you thought it would be, that's not a reflection of who you are as a person. It's just not what you thought it would be, and that's that. It's sort of an isolated experience, and it's maybe something that you can look back on and even laugh about. Imagine that. And so oversharing, this pattern of over-explaining, can be a really challenging thing to navigate in relationships. But I think understanding where it comes from, that, there's this fear of disconnection whenever there's disagreement. And so you want to go out of your way to make sure that you're saying exactly how you feel so that there's no room for interpretation. It's unquestionable. When you start to understand that you have this desire to be seen and heard by other people because maybe you didn't experience that throughout your childhood. And I think when you remind yourself that you maybe were raised in an environment where having two different perspectives on the same topic was frowned upon, it made you feel uncomfortable because maybe your parents were fearful of you becoming a bit more independent and leaning into your own personality, it starts to answer some questions. And for me, I hope the same for you, it has started to allow me to let go of some of those feelings and just let these experiences play out. And what happens when I do that, I stopped explaining myself when my husband was like, you don't have to sell me on it. Let's just go. I let it play out. I didn't stress about it. And we experienced the restaurant, and turns out it was great. And we moved on. And it's a fond memory. And I know that had it gone differently, it wouldn't have been a massive blow up. There wouldn't have been a huge source of tension there. And so I think when you are able to kind of let those things go, playing out those experiences is a great way to practice. And I've said it before, and I will say it again, I think practice is one of the best ways to unlearn unhealthy behaviors, to kind of let those things go, because you start to show yourself that that little voice in the back of your head is not speaking the truth. It's not a representation of reality. It's a trauma response. You've got maybe your parent in the back of your head. You've got a younger version of you who's fearful because this kind of a situation feels familiar. And in the past, things didn't always go as smoothly. And it's important for you to acknowledge that voice and to validate it, because the way that you behaved and the way that you conducted yourself throughout your childhood, all of these defense mechanisms, I think oversharing is very defensive. It's kind of a nervous response. You did that to survive. You did the things that you needed to do to best navigate your environment and to keep yourself safe. And so there's nothing to be frowned upon when you reflect on those feelings and when you validate that younger version of yourself. But I think for you to allow yourself to move forward in a healthy way in relationships with emotionally mature people is to recognize where these things come from and to let them go, to fight the discomfort and to let those experiences play out so that then you can show yourself that now the people that you're surrounding yourself with now are safe. This is a safe space. You can make a suggestion on a whim for a restaurant or a new place that you want to try. And you know that regardless of how it goes, regardless of how good the food is or how quickly it's brought out, that's not going to be a reflection on you. And that is not going to negatively impact your relationship with the people that are around you. So those are my thoughts on oversharing. And I would love to hear what your experience has been like with oversharing or over-explaining yourself. If you think I missed anything, definitely let me know. Send me a message or leave a comment. And yeah, if you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, give this video a like. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I think that wraps it up for episode 30. I will be back next week with episode 31 of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.